profit. If, as often happens, the government finally recognizes this and exempts new housing from rent control, there is still not an incentive to as much new building as if older buildings were also free of rent control. Depending on the extent of money depreciation since old rents were legally frozen, rents for new housing might be 10 or 20 times as high as rent in equivalent space in the old. This actually happened in France after World War II, for example. Under such conditions, existing tenants in old buildings are indisposed to move, no matter how much their families grow or their existing accommodations deteriorate. Because of low fixed rents in old buildings, the tenants already in them, and legally protected against rent increases, are encouraged to use space wastefully, whether or not their families have grown smaller. This concentrates the immediate pressure of new demand on the relatively few new buildings. It tends to force rents in them at the beginning to a higher level than they would have reached in a wholly free market. Nevertheless, this will not correspondingly encourage the construction of new housing. Builders or owners of pre-existing apartment houses, finding themselves with restricted profits or perhaps even losses on their old apartments, will have little or no capital to put into new construction. In addition, they or those with capital from other sources may fear that the government may at any time find an excuse for imposing rent controls even on the new buildings, and it often does. The housing situation will deteriorate in other ways. Most important, unless the appropriate rent increases are allowed, landlords will not trouble to remodel apartments or make other improvements in them. In fact, where rent control is particularly unrealistic or oppressive, landlords will not even keep rented houses or apartments in tolerable repair. Not only will they have no economic incentive to do so, they may not even have the funds. The rent control laws, among their other effects, create ill feeling between landlords who are forced to take minimum returns or even losses, and tenants who resent the landlord's failure to make adequate repairs. A common next step of legislatures, acting under merely political pressures or confused economic ideas, is to take rent controls off luxury apartments while keeping them on low or middle-grade apartments. The argument is that the rich tenants can afford to pay higher rents, but the poor cannot. The long-run effect of this discriminatory device, however, is the exact opposite of what its advocates intend. The builders and owners of luxury apartments are encouraged and rewarded. The builders and owners of the more needed low-rent housing are discouraged and penalized. The former are free to make as big a profit as the conditions of supply and demand warrant. The latter are left with no incentive or even capital to build more low-rent housing. The result is a comparative encouragement to the repair and remodeling of luxury apartments, and a tendency for what new private building there is to be diverted to luxury apartments. But there is no incentive to build new low-income housing, or even to keep existing low-income housing in good repair. The accommodations for the low-income groups, therefore, will deteriorate in quality, and there will be no increase in quantity. Where the population is increasing, the deterioration and shortage in low-income housing will grow worse and worse. It may reach a point where many landlords not only cease to make any profit, but are faced with mounting and compulsory losses. They may find that they cannot even give their property away. They may actually abandon their property and disappear so they cannot be held liable for taxes. When owners cease supplying heat and other basic services, the tenants are compelled to abandon their apartments. Wider and wider neighborhoods are reduced to slums. In recent years in New York City, it has become a common sight to see whole blocks of abandoned apartments with windows broken or boarded up to prevent further havoc by vandals. Arson becomes more frequent, and the owners are suspected. A further effect is the erosion of city revenues, as the property value base for such taxes continues to shrink. Cities go bankrupt or cannot continue to supply basic services. When these consequences are so clear that they become glaring, there is of course no acknowledgment on the part of the imposers of rent control that they have blundered. Instead, they denounce the capitalist system. They contend that private enterprise has failed again, that private enterprise cannot do the job. Therefore, they argue, the state must step in and itself build low-rent housing. This has been the almost universal result in every country that was involved in World War II or imposed rent control in an effort to offset monetary inflation. So the government launches on a gigantic housing program at the taxpayer's expense. The houses are rented at a rate that does not pay back costs of construction and operation. A typical arrangement is for the government to pay annual subsidies, either directly to the tenants in lower rents or to the builders or managers of the state housing. Whatever the nominal arrangement, the tenants in the buildings are being subsidized by the rest of the population. They are having part of their rent paid for them. They are being selected for favored treatment. The political possibilities of this favoritism are too clear to need stressing. A pressure group is built up that believes that the taxpayers owe it these subsidies as a matter of right. Another all but irreversible step is taken toward the total welfare state. A final irony of rent control is that the more unrealistic, draconian, and unjust it is, the more fervid the political arguments for its continuance. If the legally fixed rents are on the average 95% as high as free market rents would be, and only minor injustice is being done to landlords, there is no strong political objection to taking off rent controls, because tenants will only have to pay increases averaging about 5%. But if the inflation of the currency has been so great, or the rent control laws so repressive and unrealistic, that legally fixed rents are only 10% of what free market rents would be, and gross injustice is being done to owners and landlords, a great outcry will be raised about the dreadful evils of removing the controls and forcing tenants to pay an economic rent. The argument is made that it would be unspeakably cruel and unreasonable to ask the tenants to pay so sudden and huge an increase. Even the opponents of rent control are then disposed to concede that the removal of controls must be a very cautious, gradual, and prolonged process. Few of the opponents of rent control, indeed, have the political courage and economic insight under such conditions to ask even for this gradual decontrol. In sum, the more unrealistic and unjust the rent control is, the harder it is politically to get rid of it. In country after country, a ruinous rent control has been retained years after other forms of price control have been abandoned. The political excuses offered for continuing rent control pass credibility. The law sometimes provides that the controls may be lifted when the vacancy rate is above a certain figure. The officials retaining the rent control keep triumphantly pointing out that the vacancy rate has not yet reached that figure. Of course not. The very fact that the legal rents are held so far below market rents artificially increases the demand for rental space, at the same time as it discourages any increase in supply. So the more unreasonably low the rent ceilings are held, the more certain it is that the scarcity of rental houses or apartments will continue. The injustice imposed on landlords is flagrant. They are, to repeat, forced to subsidize the rents paid by their tenants, often at the cost of great net losses to themselves. The subsidized tenants may frequently be richer than the landlord forced to assume part of what would otherwise be his market rent. The politicians ignore this. Men in other businesses who support the imposition or retention of rent control because their hearts bleed for the tenants do not go so far as to suggest that they themselves be asked to assume part of the tenant subsidy through taxation. The whole burden falls on the single small class of people wicked enough to have built or to own rental housing. Few words carry stronger obloquy than slumlord. And what is a slumlord? He is not a man who owns expensive property in fashionable neighborhoods, but one who owns only run-down property in the slums, where the rents are lowest and where payment is most dilatory, erratic, and undependable. It is not easy to imagine why, except for natural wickedness, a man who could afford to own decent rental housing would decide to become a slumlord instead. When unreasonable price controls are placed on articles of immediate consumption, like bread, for example, the bakers can simply refuse to continue to bake and sell it. A shortage becomes immediately obvious, and the politicians are compelled to raise the ceilings or repeal them. But housing is very durable. It may take several years before tenants begin to feel the results of the discouragement to new building and to ordinary maintenance and repair. It may take even longer before they realize that the scarcity and deterioration of housing is directly traceable to rent control. Meanwhile, as long as landlords are getting any net income whatever above their taxes and mortgage interest, they seem to have no alternative but to continue holding and renting their property. The politicians, remembering that tenants have more votes than landlords, cynically continue their rent control long after they have been forced to give up general price controls. So we come back to our basic lesson. The pressure for rent control comes from those who consider only its imagined short-run benefits to one group in the population. But when we consider its long-run effects on everybody, including the tenants themselves, we recognize that rent control is not only increasingly futile, but increasingly destructive the more severe it is, and the longer it remains in effect. Chapter 19. Minimum Wage Laws. We have already seen some of the harmful results of arbitrary governmental efforts to raise the price of favored commodities. The same sort of harmful results follow efforts to raise wages through minimum wage laws. This ought not to be surprising, for a wage is, in fact, a price. It is unfortunate for clarity of economic thinking that the price of labor's services should have received an entirely different name from other prices. This has prevented most people from recognizing that the same principles govern both. Thinking has become so emotional and so politically biased on the subject of wages that in most discussions of them the plainest principles are ignored. People who would be among the first to deny that prosperity could be brought about by artificially boosting prices, people who would be among the first to point out that minimum price laws might be most harmful to the very industries they were designed to help, will nevertheless advocate minimum wage laws and denounce opponents of them without misgivings. Yet it ought to be clear that a minimum wage law is, at best, a limited weapon for combating the evil of low wages, and that the possible good to be achieved by such a law can exceed the possible harm only in proportion as its aims are modest. The more ambitious such a law is, the larger the number of workers it attempts to cover, and the more it attempts to raise their wages, the more certain are its harmful effects to exceed any possible good effects. The first thing that happens, for example, when a law is passed that no one shall be paid less than $106 for a 40-hour week, is that no one who is not worth $106 a week to an employer will be employed at all. You cannot make a man worth a given amount by making it illegal for anyone to offer him anything less, You merely deprive him of the right to earn the amount that his abilities and situation would permit him to earn, while you deprive the community even of the moderate services that he is capable of rendering. In brief, for a low wage, you substitute unemployment. You do harm all around, with no comparable compensation. The only exception to this occurs when a group of workers is receiving a wage actually below its market worth. This is likely to happen only in rare and special circumstances, or localities where competitive forces do not operate freely or adequately. But nearly all these special cases could be remedied just as effectively, more flexibly, and with far less potential harm by unionization. It may be thought that if the law forces the payment of a higher wage in a given industry, that industry can then charge higher prices for its product, so that the burden of paying the higher wage is merely shifted to consumers. Such shifts, however, are not easily made, nor are the consequences of artificial wage raising so easily escaped. A higher price for the product may not be possible. It may merely drive consumers to the equivalent imported products or to some substitute. Or if consumers continue to buy the product of the industry in which wages have been raised, the higher price will cause them to buy less of it. While some workers in the industry may be benefited from the higher wage, therefore, others will be thrown out of employment altogether. On the other hand, if the price of the product is not raised, marginal producers in the industry will be driven out of business, so that reduced production and consequent unemployment will merely be brought about in another way. When such consequences are pointed out, there are those who reply, very well, if it is true that the X industry cannot exist except by paying starvation wages, then it will be just as well if the minimum wage puts it out of existence altogether. But this brave pronouncement overlooks the realities. It overlooks, first of all, that consumers will suffer the loss of that product. It forgets, in the second place, that it is merely condemning the people who worked in that industry to unemployment. And it ignores, finally, that bad as were the wages paid in the X industry, they were the best among all the alternatives that seemed open to the workers in that industry. Otherwise, the workers would have gone into another. If, therefore, the X industry is driven out of existence by a minimum wage law, then the workers previously employed in that industry will be forced to turn to alternative courses that seemed less attractive to them in the first place. Their competition for jobs will drive down the pay offered even in these alternative occupations. There is no escape from the conclusion that the minimum wage will increase unemployment. 2. A nice problem, moreover, will be raised by the relief program designed to take care of the unemployment caused by the minimum wage law. By a minimum wage of, say, $2.65 an hour, we have forbidden anyone to work 40 hours in a week for less than $106. Suppose now we offer only $70 a week on relief. This means that we have forbidden a man to be usefully employed at, say, $90 a week, in order that we may support him at $70 a week in idleness. We have deprived society of the value of his services. We have deprived the man of the independence and self-respect that come from self-support, even at a low level, and from performing wanted work, at the same time as we have lowered what the man could have received by his own efforts. These consequences follow as long as the weekly relief payment is a penny less than $106. Yet the higher we make the relief payment, the worse we make the situation in other respects. If we offer $106 for relief, then we offer many men just as much for not working as for working. Moreover, whatever the sum we offer for relief, we create a situation in which everyone is working only for the difference between his wages and the amount of the relief, If the relief is $106 a week, for example, workers offered a wage of $2.75 an hour, or $110 a week, are in fact, as they see it, being asked to work for only $4 a week, for they can get the rest without doing anything. It may be thought that we can escape these consequences by offering work relief instead of home relief, but we merely change the nature of the consequences. Work relief means that we are paying the beneficiaries more than the open market would pay them for their efforts. Only part of their relief wage is for their efforts, therefore, while the rest is a disguised dole. It remains to be pointed out that government make work is necessarily inefficient and of questionable utility. The government has to invent projects that will employ the least skilled. It cannot start teaching people carpentry, masonry, and the like for fear of competing with established skills and arousing the antagonism of existing unions. I am not recommending it, but it probably would be less harmful all around if the government in the first place frankly subsidized the wages of sub-marginal workers at the work they were already doing. Yet this would create political headaches of its own. We need not pursue this point further, as it would carry us into problems not immediately relevant. But the difficulties and consequences of relief must be kept in mind when we consider the adoption of minimum wage laws or an increase in minimums already fixed. In 1938, when the average hourly wage paid in all manufacturing in the United States was about 63 cents an hour, Congress set a legal minimum of only 25 cents. In 1945, when the average factory wage had risen to $1.02 an hour, Congress raised the legal minimum to 40 cents. In 1949, when the average factory wage had risen to $1.40 an hour, Congress raised the minimum again to 75 cents. In 1955, when the average had risen to $1.88, Congress boosted the minimum to $1. In 1961, with the average factory wage at about $2.30 an hour, the minimum was raised to $1.15 in 1961 and to $1.25 for 1963. To shorten the account, the minimum wage was raised to $1.40 in 1967, to $1.60 in 1968, to $2 in 1974, to $2.10 in 1975, and to $2.30 in 1976, when the average wage in all private non-agricultural work was $4.87. Then, in 1977, when the actual average hourly wage in non-agricultural work was $5.26, the minimum wage was raised to $2.65 an hour, with provision made for notching it up still further in each of the next 3 years. Thus, as the prevailing hourly wage goes higher, the minimum wage advocates decide that the legal minimum must be raised at least correspondingly. Though the legislation follows the rise of the prevailing market wage rate, the myth continues to be built up that it is the minimum wage legislation that has raised the market wage. Before we finish with the topic, I should perhaps mention another argument sometimes put forward for fixing a minimum wage rate by statute. This is that in an industry in which one big company enjoys a monopoly, it need not fear competition and can offer below-market wages. This is a highly improbable situation. Such a monopoly company must offer high wages when it is formed in order to attract labor from other industries. Thereafter, it could, theoretically, fail to increase wage rates as much as other industries, and so pay substandard wages for that particular specialized skill. But this would be likely to happen only if that industry or company was sick or shrinking. If it were prosperous or expanding, it would have to continue to offer high wages to increase its labor force. We know as a matter of experience that it is the big companies, those most often accused of being monopolies, that pay the highest wages and offer the most attractive working conditions. It is commonly the small marginal firms, perhaps suffering from excessive competition, that offer the lowest wages. But all employers must pay enough to hold workers or to attract them from each other. 3. All this is not to argue that there is no way of raising wages. It is merely to point out that the apparently easy method of raising them by government fiat is the wrong way and the worst way. This is perhaps as good a place as any to point out that what distinguishes many reformers from those who cannot accept their proposals is not their greater philanthropy, but their greater impatience. The question is not whether we wish to see everybody as well off as possible. Among men of good will, such an aim can be taken for granted. The real question concerns the proper means of achieving it. And in trying to answer this, we must never lose sight of a few elementary truisms. We cannot distribute more wealth than is created. We cannot, in the long run, pay labor as a whole more than it produces. The best way to raise wages, therefore, is to raise marginal labor productivity. This can be done by many methods: by an increase in capital accumulation, that is, by an increase in the machines with which the workers are aided; by new inventions and improvements; by more efficient management on the part of employers; by more industriousness and efficiency on the part of workers; by better education and training. The more the individual worker produces, the more he increases the wealth of the whole community. The more he produces, the more his services are worth to consumers, and hence to employers. And the more he is worth to employers, the more he will be paid. Real wages come out of production, not out of government decrees. So government policy should be directed not to imposing more burdensome requirements on employers, but to following policies that encourage profits, that encourage employers to expand, to invest in newer and better machines to increase the productivity of workers. In brief, to encourage capital accumulation instead of discouraging it, and to increase both employment and wage rates. Chapter 20. Do Unions Really Raise Wages? The belief that labor unions can substantially raise real wages over the long run, and for the whole working population, is one of the great delusions of the present age. This delusion is mainly the result of failure to recognize that wages are basically determined by labor productivity. It is for this reason, for example, that wages in the United States were incomparably higher than wages in England and Germany all during the decades when the labor movement in the latter two countries was far more advanced. In spite of the overwhelming evidence that labor productivity is the fundamental determinant of wages, the conclusion is usually forgotten or derided by labor union leaders, and by that large group of economic writers who seek a reputation as liberals by parroting them. But this conclusion does not rest on the assumption, as they suppose, that employers are uniformly kind and generous men eager to do what is right. It rests on the very different assumption that the individual employer is eager to increase his own profits to the maximum. If people are willing to work for less than they are really worth to him, why should he not take the fullest advantage of this? Why should he not prefer, for example, to make $1 a week out of a workman rather than see some other employer make $2 a week out of him? And as long as this situation exists, there will be a tendency for employers to bid workers up to their full economic worth. All this does not mean that unions can serve no useful or legitimate function. The central function they can serve is to improve local working conditions and to assure that all of their members get the true market value of their services. For the competition of workers for jobs and of employers for workers does not work perfectly. Neither individual workers nor individual employers are likely to be fully informed concerning the conditions of the labor market. An individual worker may not know the true market value of his services to an employer, and he may be in a weak bargaining position. Mistakes of judgment are far more costly to him than to an employer. If an employer mistakenly refuses to hire a man from whose services he might have profited, he merely loses the net profit he might have made from employing that one man, and he may employ 100 or 1,000 men. But if a worker mistakenly refuses a job in the belief that he can easily get another that will pay him more, the error may cost him dear. His whole means of livelihood is involved. Not only may he fail to find promptly another job offering more, he may fail for a time to find another job offering remotely as much. And time may be the essence of his problem, because he and his family must eat. So he may be tempted to take a wage that he believes to be below his real worth rather than face these risks. When an employer's workers deal with him as a body, however, and set a known standard wage for a given class of work, they may help to equalize bargaining power and the risks involved in mistakes. But it is easy, as experience has proved, for unions, particularly with the help of one-sided labor legislation, which puts compulsions solely on employers, to go beyond their legitimate functions, to act irresponsibly, and to embrace short-sighted and antisocial policies. They do this, for example, whenever they seek to fix the wages of their members above their real market worth. Such an attempt always brings about unemployment. The arrangement can be made to stick, in fact, only by some form of intimidation or coercion. One device consists in restricting the membership of the union on some other basis than that of proved competence or skill. This restriction may take many forms. It may consist in charging new workers excessive initiation fees, in arbitrary membership qualifications, in discrimination, open or concealed, on grounds of religion, race, or sex, in some absolute limitation on the number of members, or in exclusion by force, if necessary, not only of the products of non-union labor, but of the products even of affiliated unions in other states or cities. The most obvious case in which intimidation and force are used to put or keep the wages of a particular union above the real market worth of its members' services is that of a strike. A peaceful strike is possible. To the extent that it remains peaceful, it is a legitimate labor weapon, even though it is one that should be used rarely and as a last resort. If his workers as a body withhold their labor, they may bring a stubborn employer who has been underpaying them to his senses. He may find that he is unable to replace these workers with workers equally good who are willing to accept the wage that the former have now rejected. But the moment workers have to use intimidation or violence to enforce their demands, the moment they use mass picketing to prevent any of the old workers from continuing at their jobs, or to prevent the employer from hiring new permanent workers to take their places, their case becomes suspect. For the pickets are really being used not primarily against the employer, but against other workers. These other workers are willing to take the jobs that the old employees have vacated, and at the wages that the old employees now reject. The fact proves that the other alternatives open to the new workers are not as good as those that the old employees have refused. If, therefore, the old employees succeed by force in preventing new workers from taking their place, they prevent these new workers from choosing the best alternative open to them, and force them to take something worse. The strikers are therefore insisting on a position of privilege, and are using force to maintain this privileged position against other workers. If the foregoing analysis is correct, the indiscriminate hatred of the strikebreaker is not justified. If the strikebreakers consist merely of professional thugs who themselves threaten violence or who cannot in fact do the work, or if they are being paid a temporarily higher rate solely for the purpose of making a pretense of carrying on until the old workers are frightened back to work at the old rates, the hatred may be warranted. But if they are in fact merely men and women who are looking for permanent jobs and willing to accept them at the old rate, then they are workers who would be shoved into worse jobs than these in order to enable the striking workers to enjoy better ones. And this superior position for the old employees could continue to be maintained, in fact, only by the ever-present threat of force. 2. Emotional economics has given birth to theories that calm examination cannot justify. One of these is the idea that labor is being underpaid generally. This would be analogous to the notion that in a free market, prices in general are chronically too low. Another curious but persistent notion is that the interests of a nation's workers are identical with each other, and that an increase in wages for one union, in some obscure way, helps all other workers. Not only is there no truth in this idea, the truth is that if a particular union by coercion is able to enforce for its own members a wage substantially above the real market worth of their services, it will hurt all other workers as it hurts other members of the community. In order to see more clearly how this occurs, let us imagine a community in which the facts are enormously simplified arithmetically. Suppose the community consisted of just half a dozen groups of workers, and that these groups were originally equal to each other in their total wages and the market value of their product. Let us say that these 6 groups of workers consist of 1. Farmhands, 2. Retail store workers, 3. Workers in the clothing trades, 4. Coal miners, 5. Building workers, and 6. Railway employees. Their wage rates, determined without any element of coercion, are not necessarily equal. But whatever they are, let us assign to each of them an original index number of 100 as a base. Now, let us suppose that each group forms a national union and is able to enforce its demands in proportion not merely to its economic productivity, but to its political power and strategic position. Suppose the result is that the farmhands are unable to raise their wages at all, that the retail store workers are able to get an increase of 10%, the clothing workers of 20%, the coal miners of 30%, the building trades of 40%, and the railroad employees of 50%. On the assumptions we have made, this will mean that there has been an average increase in wages of 25%. Now suppose, again for the sake of arithmetical simplicity, that the price of the product that each group of workers makes rises by the same percentage as the increase in that group's wages. For several reasons, including the fact that labor costs do not represent all costs, the price will not quite do that, certainly not in any short period. But the figures will nonetheless serve to illustrate the basic principle involved. We shall then have a situation in which the cost of living has risen by an average of 25%. The farmhands, though they have had no reduction in their money wages, will be considerably worse off in terms of what they can buy. The retail store workers, even though they have got an increase in money wages of 10%, will be worse off than before the race began. Even the workers in the clothing trades, with a money wage increase of 20%, will be at a disadvantage compared with their previous position. The coal miners, with a money wage increase of 30%, will have made in purchasing power only a slight gain. The building and railroad workers will of course have made a gain, but one much smaller in actuality than in appearance. But even such calculations rest on the assumption that the forced increase in wages has brought about no unemployment. This is likely to be true only if the increase in wages has been accompanied by an equivalent increase in money and bank credit. And even then, it is improbable that such distortions in wage rates can be brought about without creating areas of unemployment, particularly in the trades in which wages have advanced the most. If this corresponding monetary inflation does not occur, the forced wage advances will bring about widespread unemployment. The unemployment need not necessarily be greatest, in percentage terms, among the unions whose wages have been advanced the most, for unemployment will be shifted and distributed in relation to the relative elasticity of the demand for different kinds of labor, and in relation to the joint nature of the demand for many kinds of labor. Yet when all these allowances have been made, even the groups whose wages have been advanced the most will probably be found, when their unemployed are averaged with their employed members, to be worse off than before. And in terms of welfare, of course, the loss suffered will be much greater than the loss in merely arithmetical terms, because the psychological losses of those who are unemployed will greatly outweigh the psychological gains of those with a slightly higher income in terms of purchasing power. Nor can the situation be rectified by providing unemployment relief. Such relief, in the first place, is paid for in large part, directly or indirectly, out of the wages of those who work. It therefore reduces these wages. Adequate relief payments, moreover, as we have already seen, create unemployment. They do so in several ways. When strong labor unions in the past made it their function to provide for their own unemployed members, they thought twice before demanding a wage that would cause heavy unemployment. But where there is a relief system under which the general taxpayer is forced to provide for the unemployment caused by excessive wage rates, this restraint on excessive union demands is removed. Moreover, as we have already noted, adequate relief will cause some men not to seek work at all, and will cause others to consider that they are in effect being asked to work not for the wage offered, but only for the difference between that wage and the relief payment. And heavy unemployment means that fewer goods are produced, that the nation is poorer, and that there is less for everybody. The apostles of salvation by unionism sometimes attempt another answer to the problem I have just presented. It may be true, they will admit, that the members of strong unions today exploit, among others, the non-unionized workers. But the remedy is simple: unionize everybody. The remedy, however, is not quite that simple. In the first place, in spite of the enormous legal and political encouragements, one might in some cases say compulsions to unionization under the Wagner-Taft-Hartley Act and other laws, it is not an accident that only about a fourth of this nation's gainfully employed workers are unionized. The conditions propitious to unionization are much more special than generally recognized. But even if universal unionization could be achieved, the unions could not possibly be equally powerful, any more than they are today. Some groups of workers are in a far better strategic position than others, either because of greater numbers, of the more essential nature of the product they make, of the greater dependence on their industry of other industries, or of their greater ability to use coercive methods. But suppose this were not so. Suppose, in spite of the self-contradictoriness of the assumption, that all workers by coercive methods could raise their money wages by an equal percentage. Nobody would be any better off in the long run than if wages had not been raised at all. 3. This leads us to the heart of the question. It is usually assumed that an increase in wages is gained at the expense of the profits of employers. This may, of course, happen for short periods or in special circumstances. If wages are forced up in a particular firm, in such competition with others that it cannot raise its prices, the increase will come out of its profits. This is less likely to happen if the wage increase takes place throughout a whole industry. If the industry does not face foreign competition, it may be able to increase its prices and pass the wage increase along to consumers. As these are likely to consist for the most part of workers, they will simply have their real wages reduced by having to pay more for a particular product. It is true that as a result of the increased prices, sales of that industry's products may fall off, so that volume of profits in the industry will be reduced, but employment and total payrolls in the industry are likely to be reduced by a corresponding amount. It is possible, no doubt, to conceive of a case in which the profits in a whole industry are reduced without any corresponding reduction in employment. A case, in other words, in which an increase in wage rates means a corresponding increase in payrolls, and in which the whole cost comes out of the industry's profits without throwing any firm out of business. Such a result is not likely, but it is conceivable. Suppose we take an industry like that of the railroads, for example, which cannot always pass increased wages along to the public in the form of higher rates, because government regulation will not permit it. It is at least possible for unions to make their gains in the short run at the expense of employers and investors. The investors once had liquid funds, but they have put them, say, into the railroad business. They have turned them into rails and roadbeds, freight cars and locomotives. Once their capital might have been turned into any of 1,000 forms, but today it is trapped, so to speak, in one specific form. The railway unions may force them to accept smaller returns on this capital already invested. It will pay the investors to continue running the railroad if they can earn anything at all above operating expenses, even if it is only 0.1% on their investment. But there is an inevitable corollary of this. If the money that they have invested in railroads now yields less than money they can invest in other lines, the investors will not put a cent more into railroads. They may replace a few of the things that wear out first to protect the small yield on their remaining capital, but in the long run they will not even bother to replace items that fall into obsolescence or decay. If capital invested at home pays them less than that invested abroad, they will invest abroad. If they cannot find sufficient return anywhere to compensate them for their risk, they will cease to invest at all. Thus, the exploitation of capital by labor can at best be merely temporary. It will quickly come to an end. It will come to an end, actually, not so much in the way indicated in our hypothetical illustration, as by the forcing of marginal firms out of business entirely, the growth of unemployment, and the forced readjustment of wages and profits to the point where the prospect of normal or abnormal profits leads to a resumption of employment and production. But in the meanwhile, as a result of the exploitation, unemployment and reduced production will have made everybody poorer. Even though labor for a time will have a greater relative share of the national income will fall absolutely, so that labor's relative gains in these short periods may mean a Pyrrhic victory. They may mean that labor, too, is getting a lower total amount in terms of real purchasing power. 4. Thus we are driven to the conclusion that unions, though they may for a time be able to secure an increase in money wages for their members, partly at the expense of employers and more at the expense of non-unionized workers, cannot in the long run and for the whole body of workers increase real wages at all. The belief that they do so rests on a series of delusions. One of these is the fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc, which sees the enormous rise in wages in the last half-century, due principally to the growth of capital investment and to scientific and technological advance, and ascribes it to the unions, because the unions were also growing during this period. But the error most responsible for the delusion is that of considering merely what a rise of wages brought about by union demands means in the short run for the particular workers who retain their jobs, while failing to trace the effects of this advance on employment, production, and the living costs of all workers, including those who force the increase. One may go further than this conclusion and raise the question whether unions have not, in the long run and for the whole body of workers, actually prevented real wages from rising to the extent to which they otherwise might have risen. They have certainly been a force working to hold down or to reduce wages if their effect on net balance has been to reduce labor productivity, and we may ask whether it has not been so. With regard to productivity, there is something to be said for union policies, it is true, on the credit side. In some trades, they have insisted on standards to increase the level of skill and competence, and in their early history they did much to protect the health of their members. Where labor was plentiful, individual employers often stood to make short-run gains by speeding up workers and working them long hours, in spite of ultimate ill effects upon their health, because they could easily be replaced with others. And sometimes ignorant or short-sighted employers might even reduce their own profits by overworking their employees. In all these cases, the unions, by demanding decent standards, often increased the health and broader welfare of their members at the same time as they increased their real wages. But in recent years, as their power has grown, and as much misdirected public sympathy has led to a tolerance or endorsement of antisocial practices, unions have gone beyond their legitimate goals. It was a gain not only to health and welfare, but even in the long run to production, to reduce a 70-hour week to a 60-hour week. It was a gain to health and leisure to reduce a 60-hour week to a 48-hour week. It was a gain to leisure, but not necessarily to production and income, to reduce a 48-hour week to a 44-hour week. The value to health and leisure of reducing the working week to 40 hours is much less, the reduction in output and income more clear. But the unions now talk about, and sometimes enforce, 35 and 30-hour weeks, and deny that these can or need reduce output or income. But it is not only in reducing scheduled working hours that union policy has worked against productivity. That, in fact, is one of the least harmful ways in which it has done so. For the compensating gain, at least, has been clear. But many unions have insisted on rigid subdivisions of labor, which have raised production costs and led to expensive and ridiculous jurisdictional disputes. They have opposed payment on the basis of output or efficiency, and insisted on the same hourly rates for all their members regardless of differences in productivity. They have insisted on promotion for seniority rather than for merit. They have initiated deliberate slowdowns under the pretense of fighting speed-ups. They have denounced, insisted upon the dismissal of, and sometimes cruelly beaten men who turned out more work than their fellows. They have opposed the introduction or improvement of machinery. They have insisted that if any of their members have been laid off because of the installation of more efficient or more labor-saving machinery, the laid-off workers receive guaranteed incomes indefinitely. They have insisted on make-work rules to require more people or more time to perform a given task. They have even insisted, with the threat of ruining employers, on the hiring of people who are not needed at all. Most of these policies have been followed under the assumption that there is just a fixed amount of work to be done, a definite job fund which has to be spread over as many people and hours as possible so as not to use it up too soon. This assumption is utterly false. There is actually no limit to the amount of work to be done. Work creates work. What A produces constitutes the demand for what B produces. But because this false assumption exists, and because the policies of unions are based on it, their net effect has been to reduce productivity below what it would otherwise have been. Their net effect, therefore, in the long run and for all groups of workers, has been to reduce real wages. That is, wages in terms of the goods they will buy, below the level to which they would otherwise have risen. The real cause for the tremendous increase in real wages in the last century has been, to repeat, the accumulation of capital and the enormous technological advance made possible by it. But this process is not automatic. As a result not only of bad union but of bad governmental policies, it has in fact in the last decade come to a halt. If we look only at the average of gross weekly earnings of private non-agricultural workers in terms of paper dollars, it is true that they have risen from $107.73 in 1968 to $189.36 in August 1977. But when the Bureau of Labor Statistics allows for inflation, when it translates these earnings into $1967 to take account of the increase in consumer prices, it finds that real weekly earnings actually fell from $103.39 in 1968 to $103.36 in August 1977. This halt in the rise of real wages has not been a consequence inherent in the nature of unions. It has been the result of short-sighted union and government policies. There is still time to change both of them. Chapter 21. Enough to buy back the product. Amateur writers on economics are always asking for just prices and just wages. These nebulous conceptions of economic justice come down to us from medieval times. The classical economists worked out instead a different concept, the concept of functional prices and functional wages. Functional prices are those that encourage the largest volume of production and the largest volume of sales. Functional wages are those that tend to bring about the highest volume of employment and the largest real payrolls. The concept of functional wages has been taken over in a perverted form by the Marxists and their unconscious disciples, the purchasing power school. Both of these groups leave to cruder minds the question whether existing wages are fair. The real question, they insist, is whether or not they will work. And the only wages that will work, they tell us, the only wages that will prevent an imminent economic crash, are wages that will enable labor to buy back the product it creates. The Marxist and purchasing power schools attribute every depression of the past to a preceding failure to pay such wages. And at no matter what moment they speak, they are sure that wages are still not high enough to buy back the product. The doctrine has proved particularly effective in the hands of union leaders. Despairing of their ability to arouse the altruistic interest of the public, or to persuade employers, wicked by definition, ever to be fair, they have seized upon an argument calculated to appeal to the public's selfish motives and frighten it into forcing employers to grant union demands. How are we to know, however, precisely when labor does have enough to buy back the product, or when it has more than enough? How are we to determine just what the right sum is? As the champions of the doctrine do not seem to have made any real effort to answer such questions, we are obliged to try to find the answers for ourselves. Some sponsors of the theory seem to imply that the workers in each industry should receive enough to buy back the particular product they make. But they surely cannot mean that the makers of cheap dresses should get enough to buy back cheap dresses, and the makers of mink coats enough to buy back mink coats, or that the men in the Ford plant should receive enough to buy Fords, and the men in the Cadillac plant enough to buy Cadillacs. It is instructive to recall, however, that the unions in the automobile industry in the 1940s, when most of their members were already in the upper third of the country's income receivers, and when their weekly wage, according to government figures, was already 20% higher than the average wage paid in factories, and nearly twice as great as the average paid in retail trade, were demanding a 30% increase so that they might, according to one of their spokesmen, bolster our fast-shrinking ability to absorb the goods which we have the capacity to produce. What then of the average factory worker and the average retail worker? If under such circumstances the automobile workers needed a 30% increase to keep the economy from collapsing, would a mere 30% have been enough for the others? Or would they have required increases of 55 to 160% to give them as much per capita purchasing power as the automobile workers? For let us remember that then, as now, enormous differences existed between the average wage levels of different industries. In 1976, workers in retail trade averaged weekly earnings of only $113.96, while workers in all manufacturing averaged $207.60, and those in contract construction $284.93. We may be sure, if the history of wage bargaining, even within individual unions, is any guide, that the automobile workers, if this last proposal had been made, would have insisted on the maintenance of their existing differentials. For the passion for economic equality, among union members as among the rest of us, is, with the exception of a few rare philanthropists and saints, a passion for getting as much as those above us in the economic scale already get, rather than a passion for giving those below us as much as we ourselves already get. But it is with the logic and soundness of a particular economic theory, rather than with these distressing weaknesses of human nature, that we are at present concerned. 2. The argument that labor should receive enough to buy back the product is merely a special form of the general purchasing power argument. The workers' wages, it is correctly enough contended, are the workers' purchasing power. But it is just as true that everyone's income, the grocer's, the landlord's, the employer's, is his purchasing power for buying what others have to sell. And one of the most important things for which others have to find purchasers is their labor services. All this, moreover, has its reverse side. In an exchange economy, everybody's money income is somebody else's cost. Every increase in hourly wages, unless or until compensated by an equal increase in hourly productivity, is an increase in costs of production. An increase in costs of production, where the government controls prices and forbids any price increase, takes the profit from marginal producers, forces them out of business, means a shrinkage in production and a growth in unemployment. Even where a price increase is possible, the higher price discourages buyers, shrinks the market, and also leads to unemployment. If a 30% increase in hourly wages all around the circle forces a 30% increase in prices, labor can buy no more of the product than it could at the beginning, and the merry-go-round must start all over again. No doubt many will be inclined to dispute the contention that a 30% increase in wages can force as great a percentage increase in prices. It is true that this result can follow only in the long run, and only if monetary and credit policy permit it. If money and credit are so inelastic that they do not increase when wages are forced up, and if we assume that the higher wages are not justified by existing labor productivity in dollar terms, then the chief effect of forcing up wage rates will be to force unemployment. And it is probable in that case that total payrolls, both in dollar amount and in real purchasing power, will be lower than before. For a drop in employment brought about by union policy and not as a transitional result of technological advance necessarily means that fewer goods are being produced for everyone. And it is unlikely that labor will compensate for the absolute drop in production by getting a larger relative share of the production that is left. For Paul H. Douglas in America and A.C. Pigou in England, the first from analyzing a great mass of statistics, the second by almost purely deductive methods, arrived independently at the conclusion that the elasticity of the demand for labor is somewhere between 3 and 4. This means, in less technical language, that a 1% reduction in the real rate of wage is likely to expand the aggregate demand for labor by not less than 3%. Or, to put the matter the other way, if wages are pushed up above the point of marginal productivity, the decrease in employment would normally be from 3 to 4 times as great as the increase in hourly rates, so that the total incomes of the workers would be reduced correspondingly. Even if these figures are taken to represent only the elasticity of the demand for labor revealed in a given period of the past, and not necessarily to forecast that of the future, they deserve the most serious consideration. 3. But now let us suppose that the increase in wage rates is accompanied or followed by a sufficient increase in money and credit to allow it to take place without creating serious unemployment. If we assume that the previous relationship between wages and prices was itself a normal long-run relationship, then it is altogether probable that a forced increase of, say, 30% in wage rates will ultimately lead to an increase in prices of approximately the same percentage. The belief that the price increase would be substantially less than that rests on two main fallacies. The first is that of looking only at the direct labor costs of a particular firm or industry and assuming these to represent all the labor costs involved. But this is the elementary error of mistaking a part for the whole. Each industry represents not only just one section of the productive process considered horizontally, but just one section of that process considered vertically. Thus, the direct labor cost of making automobiles in the automobile factories themselves may be less than a third, say, of the total costs. And this may lead the incautious to conclude that a 30% increase in wages would lead to only a 10% increase or less in automobile prices. But this would be to overlook the